All right, we're excited everybody's joining in. We're going to give it a few minutes, and then Mark and I will get started with the webinar. But thanks for joining so far. Well, give me a sign whenever you feel like most people. It looks like things are slowing down, and we'll get started. I can't see that part of it, so.
All right, we'll give it a couple minutes. We know sometimes it takes a little bit of time for people to roll in here. So love to have you share in the chat where you're joining us from. We got Washington, we got Maine, so we got both coasts, so it's good. That's great. We got some folks here in the Midwest, so glad to have you. Spring is coming, I promise. Got some folks in Florida. Good. Hey, Chuck, glad to have you from West Virginia. All right, we'll give it like one more minute here, as I know sometimes you sit in the waiting room and it just spins, always kind of wondering what's happening there.
Yeah, I love seeing all the locations. Thank you, everybody.
So
All right.
the folks at NDSU, I'll make you stop by and check on my kid who's a fresh or a junior there. So all right. All right.
While everybody's joining in, we can take a little bit take care of some housekeeping while we're getting ready, and then hopefully everybody gets on before we start. But again, thank you for joining us. Mark and I are excited to spend the next hour with everybody, just talking through a really important topic, and we're going to touch on a few areas on why we think this is so critical. How do we maintain momentum during a campaign? We'll share some trends on how long campaigns are going and during the different phases, and why spending some time in each of those phases, really thinking about how we maintain that momentum, keep things going, is so critical. So again, we're excited to have you all, and let's dig in. So just a little bit of housekeeping, as we said. If you have any questions at all, please use the Q&A feature. We'll monitor that. Mark and I would love at the end of this to have some time to kind of go through some of those, answer any questions you have. Then also, we'll be sending this out in the next day or two, probably actually maybe early next week, with it being a Thursday. So you guys can have the recording as well, if you ever want to go back and look at anything. So please use that Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Again, a little bit about us. I'm Andy Canada, Senior Managing Vice President here at BWF. Excited to be with you. My background, I've been in consulting about 14 years. Prior to that, I worked at the Indiana University Foundation in Bloomington, Indiana as a Director of Development. And before that, Purdue University, with my alma mater, where I also worked in annual giving, plan giving, and then a Director of Development. So I got to see two large-scale campaigns in each of those institutions, and then also a number of campaigns throughout my time consulting. So excited to be with you all. Mark?
Yeah, great. I'm Mark Marshall. I'm Chief Strategy Officer here, which and also one of the co-owners, and have had spent my entire career in advancement and in fundraising. So really excited to get a chance to talk about that. And what we're hoping to do today is really talk about the broad spectrum. We've got folks from across the philanthropic spectrum here. So feel free to ask questions as we go. We'll do our best to answer them as we go. And you're going to hear some things that might pertain more to one sector or another, but I'm always happy to kind of talk through them a little bit. And I think it's a great opportunity to learn in a much more broad spectrum and what works for you and your team.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mark. So look, kind of recap a little bit what's coming up next. So we're going to kind of cover some key phases. So planning for success. How do we really maximize the early stage before we even get into a campaign, and how critical that is? That leadership phase of the campaign. What are some things to do to engage partners across your organization, and engage volunteers, make sure you've got the foundation really set before we move into the next stage. The public phase, which is what a lot of, especially our volunteers, think about. They think about the big event, they think about the news release. So we'll touch on some areas there, really keeping that momentum, and then we'll close up with sort of after the public phase. How do we put a bow on the campaign and really make sure we're launched and ready for the next big thing the organization might be looking into? What we'd like to do is put a poll up and just gather some feedback from you all. So you'll see a few questions up here. Are you currently in a campaign with your organization? Are you currently planning for a future campaign? What does that look like? And then that last question is not popping up for me. I think it's something around, Mark, maybe you can see it, but it's
Yes. So really, when have you seen momentum lag in a campaign?
yeah.
What's the spot that concerns you the most?
Yeah, I'm just watching some of these. We've got a good blend of currently in a campaign right now, about 70%. Yeah, great feedback. It gives us a sense kind of where the audience is at, and we can touch on some specifics, but it looks like a nice blend across the board there.
I think the quick answer is if you're not in a campaign, sounds like you're planning a campaign.
Yeah.
So not surprising, but that's exciting. So great. All right. With that said, this has been really helpful, and looks like a lot of concern, particularly around the leadership phase and the public phase. And it's honestly, the public phase is probably one of the pieces that is most often misunderstood, notably by volunteers, but also by institutional leadership. So we'll look forward to talking about that a little bit more here. So great. All right. Well, with that in mind, what we thought maybe do is walk through a little bit what the campaign ecosystem looks like today. Um, so if we can advance that slide, Andy, that'd be awesome.
Yep, I'm working on it. I can't get there we go.
There we go. All right. Well, just to give you an idea about the ecosystem, there's a few things. One is we think about campaign lengths. One of the gifts of what Andy and I and our teams get to do is we spend a lot of time talking to donors on behalf of institutions and organizations. And so we get a lot of transparency in a really interesting way. So there's a lot of campaign fatigue. If we go back to the 80s and 90s, most places did a campaign when they needed to build something. A lot of the big institutions, higher ed institutions, did a campaign only maybe once a decade. Many institutions did their first campaign in the 80s or the 90s. Right now, we're seeing campaign lengths in higher ed ranging from 7 to 8 years. Some are a little shorter, some are a little longer, but those are long campaigns, particularly in challenging spots where you see presidents' terms shrinking, right? But the campaigns are lengthening. We also, healthcare, we're averaging about 5 to 7, some shorter at smaller institutions, some longer at larger institutions. And then when we get into social and human services, we're seeing about 3 to 5 years, depending upon size of the organization, but a lot of campaigns out there. So there's a lot of messaging. So you're not just competing with who's in your neighborhood, you're competing with campaign experience across the country as well as down the street. And then we're also in continuous campaign. We have a campaign model where we have folks that are they're planning. We've actually done studies for an organization when they're still in their current campaign for the next campaign. That campaign model, there's a lot to learn from it and a lot of great things that you can learn by rolling into, what did we learn from this campaign as we prep for the next one. The last piece is really thinking about the donor pyramid, and I tend to refer to it as a donor obelisk, because the focus on the top 10 to 15 gifts, that top 1 to 5% of donors continues to intensify as wealth becomes more concentrated as a country. It's going to be important to think about as you think about the campaign. All right, with that, we'll jump on. Great. And we have a question about talking about managing volunteer expectations during a quiet or a planning phase. and we know they're eager to get started. So we're going to touch on that in just a quick minute here.
Yep.
And as a note, we as a methodology wise, we tend to think about the campaign as a planning phase and a leadership phase. I appreciate the concept of the quiet phase. That was the industry term. I always say they're lousy secrets. Everybody knows about them. We want to talk about the campaign, so we really want to think about how do we plan properly and really create leadership engagement. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. One of the genesis behind this discussion was really thinking about momentum. How do we really make sure that we keep people ask why a campaign? Well, the campaign should be like a race, right? And if you're running a marathon, you don't stop halfway through and take a break. And you want to keep the right pacing of that race. And that's how the campaign should be functioning. So we want to make sure that we get all the momentum from the planning and roll that into the leadership or major gifts phase, and we roll that into the public phase, and that we burst through the finish line, don't collapse across the finish line. So that's where we want that momentum to stay with us the entire way.
Yeah, people ask all the time, like, what are the factors in campaigns? And I say momentum almost every single time. I mean, if you lose that momentum and it starts to wane, it can be hard to get it back. So we think about how do we keep that constant projection up and not have those dips or those flat lines. They're going to happen every campaign, but how do we minimize them to make sure we're always trending in the upward direction with that? And people love jumping on when things are going well. So how do we make sure we keep those in front of folks?
Former colleagues, Bruce Drian was a consultant with us for many years. Used to always talk about starting well is more important than starting quickly. And it's not uncommon when you have new leadership at an institution or a new board member. We'll often say, let's get a campaign going. We want to start. It is really hard to undo the challenges of a quickly started campaign that was not planned for properly. And it's one of the reasons a few years ago we actually started a strategic planning service, partially because we found that all the great campaign plans in the world can't undo a bad strategic plan. So we want to make sure that the process matters. So planning for the campaign about messaging, about do we have the right volunteers? Do we have the right leadership? Do we have the right team? Do we have the resources we need, including things like data and financing? Those are important elements of a good planning process. And then as we think about that leadership phase, do we move into that leadership phase and do we have the right leadership donors, the right volunteer leadership, all those components? And we found this is a great cycle that just, again, done right, keeps carrying us from one to the next. So we're going to walk through that with you today.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, we're going to kind of take each of these phases and kind of give some examples, kind of talk through what are things to look for, what are maybe some things to avoid if at all possible, and just how critical each stage is. So, as Mark said, I mean, as we set the stage for the campaign, I mean, so this is kind of before we're into it. And why this is so critical, as Mark said, is we don't want to rush this. There's so many times we'll get called and be like, hey, we've got a reunion coming or an anniversary coming up, or a board member said we need to be in a campaign, so we need to do X, Y, and Z, and we're going to launch something next month, or maybe that might be an exaggeration. But that speed can sometimes get you in trouble. And if we don't set the stage properly up front, it can really make things difficult downstream as the campaign's going on. And that's where we see sometimes those campaigns really flatline if we haven't put the time in up here to really do it properly. And we're going to look at kind of 4 key areas as we think about campaign planning and that prep work. The first is, as Mark said, strategic planning. And some people say, well, that's not really part of a campaign. But when you think about making sure that the campaign aligns with the vision of the organization, it really goes back to that strategic plan. Where are we headed? What are we hoping to accomplish? Is our mission vision still in alignment? Is it still what we're shooting for? That allows us to really make sure that the campaign is focusing in the right area and understanding how fundraising and philanthropy can really make a difference. It creates a lot of ownership and buy-in. You're going to hear us talk about that ownership and buy-in a lot during this session. It allows us every piece of the puzzle. If someone owns it, if they grab onto it and say, yes, this is right, you're always going to have a champion as you go forward. It's not just you in the advancement or development office doing it. It's not just a dean or the president. you're creating ownership within the organization saying, this is why we're doing this. This is why this is so critical. So again, it can be kind of a daunting task. And some people hear strategic planning like, oh, it's going to take forever. But done right, it brings the organization together and really captures where we're headed, which allows you to build that campaign in a really solid way going forward.
And Andy, to touch on Kaylee's question about, what are some strategies for managing volunteer expectations? Involve them in the process.
Yeah.
Having your development committee of your board, assembling a campaign task force to create some transparency is great ways to build partners, to make sure you're properly resourced, and to make sure that the success of the campaign isn't on the development staff, isn't on the president of the university or the CEO of the hospital or the executive director of the organization. It's a great way to involve people. So, and it's a great way to make sure that they have their clarity to the expectations. You can do some education around what a good campaign looks like. And that way you don't end up owning it all by yourself.
And that understanding is critical, and it's easier said than done. We understand that. The volunteers, if they have something in their mind, or even leadership, they want to do it. But even unpacking what is a campaign, what are those elements that go into it, it really starts to say, okay, this is going to take time to do this properly. And here's what's possible if we do this, and here are some roadblocks or pitfalls if we don't. The other piece is just internally. Are we ready as an organization to really take this on? And we talk about making sure the team has felt supported. Make sure the team, your internal fundraising team, has their voice be heard. They're part of the process. Campaigns can sometimes be scary to fundraising staff and development staff and advancement staff. They're already doing a whole lot of work, really well. And now we're going to ask them to put something else on top of it. So how do we go through a process of understanding what's working well? What are areas that we could be improving as we ramp up for a campaign? What are opportunities? But also helping the team really understand how their piece fits into the overall puzzle. Lots of times we start off talking about the leadership gifts, which are critical, but at the same time, we want to be building the annual fund. We want to be building the pipeline. We want to make sure our communications are done right. So that campaign readiness allows you to kind of take that step to really understand it and educate the internal team and make sure they feel part of the process as we go forward. Going forward, as we come out of the strategic plan, is really a great time to really identify what are the major themes. The strategic plan should have helped identify where we're heading as an organization. What are those themes that we think fundraising can really have a significant impact on? Where does it fit within the budget? Where can we really move the needle to advance the organization? Those themes should start bubbling up. And again, as Mark said, this is a great way to engage different members of your organization, your board, your staff. So we don't want this just to be on the fundraising team's lap. We want everyone in the organization and our key volunteers to own this. So if we start going through this process, identifying themes, if someone has a special project they want to do, but it doesn't fit, this can be a time to kind of start sorting through that and figure out, okay, we don't have a solid champion for this. It doesn't fit with the vision. So let's really start honing things in a little bit. So we've got the right roadmap going forward as we start building out a prospectus to start testing with some of our donors.
And there's a tendency for folks to sometimes want to cut out the readiness assessment, notably on the internal. It's expensive, right? But it really does a few things for you. It really looks at do we have the infrastructure we need to support a campaign? Because if you get the real value of the campaign, everything is working at a higher level and level of intensity. And that just creates some challenges. So one of those things that should be looked at is data. And we'll talk about that as kind of what's that momentum carry through. So let's assume you do everything right. You do a planning study where you're looking internally and externally, as Andy outlines here. We'll talk about how we take those pieces and make that into a really step into the campaign in the right way.
No, great catch on the data part, Mark. I think that internal readiness could be external too, but how do we make sure we're utilizing our database and really understanding what opportunities are out there? What is the data showing us as possible? That helps us as we think about setting a goal and really think about if we make some changes, improvements, what that allows us to do. So again, elements that don't sound all that exciting when you're going through and you're thinking about the campaign goal, but all critical pieces to make sure we're getting that campaign goal and getting the internal team ready to make sure we're on the same page.
Yeah, so let's jump into the leadership phase of this.
Yep.
Yeah, so coming out of the planning phase, right? You've gathered a lot of information. You've talked to volunteers, you've talked to donors, institutional leadership. You've looked at the infrastructure, you've looked at the data, and this is really your chance to take that information and all of it. A well-done study should come to you with a lot of actionable information. What can I do to make this happen? And so what we want to do is we want to sit down and we want to look at all these different things about what's our prospect pool look like. And that's my shortcut for data, but the ability to get information in and out of that really matters. Talk to the institution about priority, adjust the messages into who the messages are going to, how are we going to deploy our leadership, engagement of key prospects. So we're going to jump ahead and we're going to talk about that. So, yeah, a quick question in here in this planning piece about CRM transition. It's Samantha, it's a very popular topic right now. The two competing topics that get asked are, what if we're about to do a CRM transition, and what if we're in a leadership transition? I'm finding most institutions are somewhere in both of those things, and it's likely that the lifespan of the life cycle of the institution is unwilling to wait, but you do want to manage for it. We've seen places crippled by both of those things. So that's where a little bit of some of that planning study, that prep work really does wonders for helping you gauge the risk and manage for it, in both cases. And the ability to get at data is going to be mission critical. We may want to make sure that you walk out of there with the ability to refine priorities. For most organizations, and I'm going to say organizations with databases above 25 or 50,000 people, you're going to get your most accurate guess on guess is the wrong word, prediction on what you can make, you can raise during your campaign for setting that campaign goal or working goal is going to come from a statistical evaluation of your database, right? The interview process that is still offers a lot of value is going to offer you depth to that data. But you're going to want to come back from that and you're going to spend time to talk about evaluating that feedback. What do people say? You're going to have wonderfully important things you're going to want to do that donors won't care about. They're just not a priority, but that's your chance to know that you heard them, and you also heard how you talk about the institution and the priorities might not be received. I'm gonna give you an example. We were working with a children's hospital somewhere, and they were building a physician's tower, and it came across very negatively to donors that they were going to build a physician's office. When that was slightly repositioned as a family care center, was what it was. It really consolidated where people had to go, where families had to go to get care into one building rather than scattered across an area. It was really positively received by donors. So it was really about listening. Other times, the campaign theme might have a negative implication to donors that the institution didn't think about. Those are the types of things. Let them know you heard them. Key prospects. You've talked to, this is why, as you think about the focus into that campaign obelisk, most campaigns, there's probably about 200 to 400 donors that really matter for the life of a campaign. And so are we talking to them in a very structured way? The first campaign I ever worked on was we had a campaign brochure that looked like the Sears Wish Book. For those of you who are old enough to remember the Sears Wish Book, it was a magical thing that showed up in October and November and had every toy you'd ever want in it. But most donors don't want that today. They want focused messaging around priorities that are important to them and that they care about. But it's an opportunity to also think about who engages them. What's the science of this? Knowing that a donor who you think, we do an Engage DX survey, which I think is amazing. But you'll have a donor who you think is really engaged, and they'll tell you that, I'm not really that engaged. This is the opportunity in a campaign to change that. Okay, let's jump on to that next piece here. How do we deploy our leadership? How do we prepare them? And this is that going back to that question about volunteer leaders. This is the chance to get them out opening doors. Assumptions that they make about who should be giving. Hey, this is a great chance to get them out, to prepare them to go have that conversation and be an advocate for you, your organization, and what you need to do. Really deploying them and getting them out and having, whether it's large events. We had one institution that they went around the country and did a barnstorming tour with their alumni and friends, where they did an overview of the top 5 priorities, and they were set up as listening sessions, and they were really well received, made people feel engaged. Lots of strategies that you can do to do this, but getting that volunteer, that leadership out there talking to people, goes a long way to creating that opportunity for them. There's also an opportunity to think about experiences. There was a organization that I worked with that did homeless mental health. In some ways, nothing more challenging from a prestige factor than homeless mental health. But they somehow talked some of the wealthiest families in America into going on a volunteer did that, by the way, into going on a tour of homeless camps, made them donors forever. They cared about the place very deeply. These are all opportunities to create experiences and opportunities to work with donors. You have different ones on your campus than other people have. Defining what those are really matters. And then the last piece here, I'm going to jump into, and we will come back a little bit to talk about some of the, particularly when we move into annual giving and bigger pieces here. We're gonna cover that, Amanda, in the public piece. Want to make sure. Let's jump to this next piece here. Yeah. So the piece, end of the day, what matters a lot is, do we have donors who will support our mission, and can we get them engaged? This is your opportunity for the planning piece to tell you. Basically, I sometimes I love playing games. I refer to this sometimes as the game board. Part of our task here is to populate this game board. And what the value of the kind of the gift chart range works, because you're going to do great work with 3 prospects, and 2 of them, for whatever reason, aren't going to make that gift to the organization. But one of them is going to. One of them is going to because they think there's a great opportunity. But this is our opportunity at the front end of the campaign in that leadership phase to populate that prospect pool. We had a healthcare client that had 3 priorities. And when we tested that, we found that one of the priorities was really well understood. The other 2 were less understood at varying levels. And we ended up doing a little bit of a serial campaign. And that campaign allowed the organization to spend time to build prospects around the less understood priorities. And they did some education, a variety of things. Meanwhile, donors were ready to make gifts to the first priority. So really scaling, understanding your prospect pool, prioritizing who you could engage with, who you didn't, engaging in outreach. But it really allows you to get the momentum from the study and appropriately apply across that piece. A question in here is really about how you avoid some of the pitfalls of the linear process, is making sure you don't skip over the parts that are problematic. You may hit a snag that there's a priority that's not well understood. Post-COVID, for example, donors are really questioning facilities. And they're questioning facilities because 50% of college students take at least some or all of their classes online. So those are the things that donors are saying, well, why are we building this facility? All important things to think about. So we'll just want to make sure that we're looking for opportunities, and always happy, by the way, to follow up on some specific questions too as we go here. With that in mind, I want to be mindful of time, and Andy, let's jump
on the public raise. I'll circle back on that question. The other thing I think for everyone to keep in mind is, we call it leadership phase. Some people say silent, quiet, whatever. We don't want it that. So the way you kind of keep it from being linear is always be celebrating wins. So as you get large gifts in, as you get programs up and running during that leadership phase, you can still talk about it. You can still celebrate that, even though we're not announcing the full scale campaign yet. Let people know there's excitement within your organization, and you can tie it back to your strategic plan. You can say, here's what we're doing to fund the strategic plan. It doesn't have to be directly tied to a campaign. And then on the leadership pieces, we're going into the public phase here.
Yeah,
No matter what size
Andy, real
organization.
quick, before we jump on there, one of the things that happens during the leadership phase, going back to the volunteer question, is a lot of the volunteers think that there's going to be something leadership with all thinks there's something magical about sharing the campaign and a number, and that people are going to rush to the front door to start handing over gifts. I haven't seen it happen yet. Maybe it happens, but what it does is it allows you to start socializing this and introducing that key group of people who are going to fund this disproportionately. And that's why we want to make sure we keep the focused energy of, when we think about leadership phase, we want to focus on leadership donors, organizational leadership, both volunteer and staff. And we want to make sure that that leadership is focused on adjusting what we learned during the planning phase, thinking about that through line all the way through. So in a perfect world, it's allowed us to focus that resource and be in position to have a defined campaign goal and what happens for the rest of this campaign in the public phase.
Yep. No, I agree with that 100%. The other piece I would add on to that is when we go public with a campaign, there shouldn't be like any big initiatives that are surprises. We can still be talking about the initiative. We can still be explaining we're going to be raising XYZ for maybe not a dollar, but scholarships or new programs. Again, it's that packaging that we don't have to say it's a campaign, but we want to build momentum throughout that early phase of the leadership phase so our leadership donors are committing, our other donors who don't know they're giving to a campaign yet are giving to something they're excited about because we're talking about these specific initiatives in different ways to them. So as we come out of the leadership phase and we start thinking about the public phase, what are just some key areas to be looking at? One is, how do we make sure our volunteers are staying fresh and energized? How do we really take that broader message to the masses, if you will, sort of put it in the front page of the newspaper, if there is a thing anymore like that? Program updates, and then priority resetting. So let's talk through some of those elements as we go forward here.
And by the way, not uncommon. One of the things that we recommended a fair amount is different volunteers for different phases.
Right.
Particularly when you're, as we mentioned, higher ed campaigns range 7 to 8 years. I don't want a car payment for 5 years. The last thing I want to do is make a volunteer commitment for 7 or 8 years. So most volunteers, they'll work very hard for a 2 to 3 year period of time. Don't be afraid to use phased campaign volunteers. Ask them to chair a part of a phase, and that's much more palatable to donors and volunteers, that I can be an intense volunteer for 2 years and then I take a step back. They'll appreciate it. You'll appreciate it.
No, and Mark, you're gonna have a much better chance of getting the volunteers that you really want if we're not asking them to sign up for a 5-year stretch. If we're saying a year and a half, 2 years, whatever that might be, they're more apt to say, yeah, I'll join you for that journey. And many times they'll stay on. They'll want to be part of it because, if we've done our job and we've created that buy-in, but we want to give them those opportunities, and it allows us the opportunity to bring new volunteers in as well. So as we're thinking about the public phase, what are some key things to be looking at? One is volunteers, as we just talked about. The other is really examining the campaign goal. What is that final number? We've been working with a number up through the early phases. We've identified sort of where the database, the data is telling us we can go in the conversations, but let's hone that in before we go public. And then refine the campaign priorities, as Mark said, as we've had early conversations with leadership donors and understand where the organization is at, do we need to make a few tweaks? Has something new come up that we weren't expecting? That can be dangerous. Don't add too much, but is the opportunity to sort of evaluate what's working really well, where's the organization at, and do we need to make some adjustments before really taking that campaign out to a larger scale? The volunteer piece Mark just touched on. Keep it fresh, keep it exciting for them. Don't ask them to sign up for the entire campaign. Think about your different constituencies. This is really where you can scale this from your organization size standpoint. This might be where you have multiple different groups serving different constituents, or it could just be one sort of central campaign cabinet. Again, this is one where, depending on the size of the organization, the size of the campaign, you can really adjust depending on your individual circumstances.
Yeah, one of the questions too that was asked is about why replace for the latter part. One is these people are often to be honest with you, they're a little tired. They've shown up to a lot of meetings. I think one of the gifts of COVID maybe was that Zoom meetings are more tolerable. But it also, one of the things is you're thinking about that cycle that we talked about at the beginning, right? You finish this campaign, what's going to be the next priority? Um, Part of what the public phase should do for you in particular is start engaging the leadership of the next campaign. One of the places of campaigns that I've seen have really hit snags is where they keep going back to the same well over and over and over again, and they get a little exhausted by the fact that they're dealing with, I've interviewed leadership donors who have said, I think I've done my part. Can't they get new people? And they will do it for a while, but again, 7-year campaigns at the university get a little exhausting.
And I think thinking about that, when our current donors who have been with us for a long time and been those top donors, when they see new donors come in and sort of begin to make those major gifts, whatever that means for your organization, they get energized and excited.
Yeah.
So they may scale back, but it also may motivate them like, okay, other people are buying into this, I'm going to continue to support. So they want to see, back to momentum, they want to see momentum of the organization, not just the singular campaign, but where we're going as a whole.
Yeah, and
Again,
Andy,
excited.
we have another question about leadership, university leadership needs and priorities versus those that may resonate better externally. I tend to function off a little bit of a rubric. By the way, it's a great question. I remember once we did a study basically just to tell someone that their idea was a bad idea. That was important to the board that we told them that, not the board. But one of the ways is I think about it as a little bit of a rubric. Is it tied to the institutional or organizational strategic plan?
Yep.
Right? Is it, or is it some random like thing somebody wants to do? We want it tied to the strategic plan. Does the priority have a natural constituency? Because if there's not enough people to care about it, it can't be a campaign priority. Might be a targeted opportunity. When we think of other things that will be, is there an internal champion? Is there somebody here who says this is important to the institution? They're willing to be your spokesperson. Do we have a board member or external volunteer who cares about this? If someone on your board doesn't care about one of your priorities, you can't find one person on the board to care about it, it's probably not an institutional priority. And then the last one is the time horizon big enough? They can't say we need this in 6 months. That's not a campaign, that's a special fundraising effort, not a campaign. If you think about those 5 check boxes that you get, then it can qualify, and it gives a little bit of a framework for deciding if something makes sense or not. And some of those other priorities become targets of opportunity. If you have a $20 million donor or a $10 million donor willing to fund a priority single-handedly, and the institution says this matters, absolutely, it's a great gift. But those become campaigns of one, and that's okay.
No, and it's to that question, it's a challenge when you're in that middle seat, right? You're trying to build a campaign, your president or your CEO saying we need this, but your donors are telling you this. How do you match that up? I would lean into the volunteers. If you've got a good volunteer base, your board, they can be that sounding board for the leadership of saying, hey, we're not, this isn't, to Mark's point, this is not, we're not going to be champions of this because of this. We've got to find that balance, and we've got to find that balance and kind of direction before we move into the public phase. So we look united throughout this area. As we think about the public phase, it's more than an event, and a lot of people, especially volunteers, get really excited about the big ball. We're gonna have videos, we're gonna have all this stuff, which is important to some organizations. Others, it's not as critical. But it's more than that. It's about how do we get the messaging out? How do we continue to tell the story and talk about the impact of the campaign? It's not a number. The number is one piece of it, but we've got to get our constituents to understand what the impact of this is going to have on the organization, what we're trying to accomplish, our community, our state, our world. That's what makes public phase of a campaign really fun and exciting. When we get that messaging alignment through our annual fund, through our magazines, through our websites, continually telling that story. And don't lose sight of when you're from your gift officers, this is the time to ramp up, not pull back. Annual fund should be stepping up and doing more and more around the campaign, but personal visits have to maintain. We have to close this campaign out on a strong note. So more visits. We're probably going to move into some discovery here, as Mark said, of setting up maybe some of the next major donors to our future campaign. But get out, see people, tell the story. The early phase of a public campaign can really be a great time to get in the door, because donors are hearing from you in different ways. They want to know more. Be the ones to take that message out and invite them in so they understand exactly what's going on. And then again, tie those annual giving messages, those mailings, those emails back to the campaign. Make sure we're talking about those priorities, those campaign themes over and over again, so people really understand. Again, it shouldn't be a surprise, but make sure we're really tying those pieces together for them.
Yeah, and I would add one thing here as you're thinking about each phase of the campaign, and you as the development professionals will care about this. You may or may not have mixed ownership of this by the institution, but the dollar goals are important. I want to be clear on that. Hitting dollar goals is the really important part of a campaign. It allows us to fund our mission. That's important. But each phase of your campaign, you should have programmatic goals.
Yep.
So, and I would argue that that's nowhere more important than in the public phase of a campaign. It gets kind of rushed through, and there's a variety of things. And I can think of one president who was so frustrated when we did a post-campaign assessment, which has become a very popular thing to do. And we identified several hundred donors to a small liberal arts college that they had done everything with over the course of the campaign, but never made the ask. So, what's the priority? So one of those programmatic things might be that you make that initial major gift ask of everyone that's been cultivated in the life of the campaign. It might be to acquire X number of new donors. Use the leverage of the campaign that does things for you. I can think of one institution that they had dipped in their annual giving. I personally find that us accepting the decline in donor counts is okay as a problem as an industry. We need to be making sure every year we should be leaving the year with more donors. We may have chasing alumni participation, that kind of stuff is more challenging, but we should have more donors each and every year. But what are our donor counts? Do we need to have more donors of diverse backgrounds, whether female, males, age backgrounds, certain organizations or communities more represented than they are? But think through each phase of the campaign and make sure you're checking off those programmatic things that build your program for the long term.
Yep, no, I love that. Also, I think as you think about the campaign, those check marks, how have we done engaging different members of the organization, whether it's the CFO or deans or physicians, whatever it might be for the organization, do they feel more ownership of the fundraising development process? I think is a key piece of that as well.
Yeah. Toby's got a great question in here I'm gonna come back to in a second here. But after we get to after the public phase, though, we should be thinking about again, what does the campaign look like on the way out? So we have a great institution here in town, Dunwoody Technical College, that they're in the process of beginning to wrap up their campaign. So they're working really hard on donor experience on the back end of this. How are they preparing to make sure that the donors leave this campaign so that they can head into the next campaign? It's lurking out there somewhere. But donor experience, by the way, really, really matters. During COVID, I would tell you places that were working, national nonprofits did a much better job than the brick and mortar places like higher ed and healthcare. They did. But there's things that you all and we all can learn from what was done there. But what do we want to make sure people leaving the campaign to experience it. It's our chance to say thank you and engage them in a way that has them recycle back to us. And what's really the wrap up? What's the wrap up of this so that the campaign just doesn't, just abruptly end? That what's the follow-up so we don't have this intense experience of engagement, and then suddenly it's like would never talked to them before, or it goes right back to what it was before the campaign.
But Mark, that's exactly what I was going to say. That's the risk, right? We've talked about campaigns historically of you have these high peaks, and then after the campaign, you see this significant drop off in donors and dollars. Done properly, and if we end the campaign on a high note, we're not sort of slogging across the finish line, we're really hitting our stride. That allows us to maintain. Our dollars may go down slightly just because we're not in that intensive phase, but our donors feel good, they feel stewarded, they understand what we were able to accomplish. So utilizing this time period to circle back and say, well, look at all these things we were able to do, and here's the true impact. It's not about what it really what it did for the institution. It matters what it did for the mission, and allowing those things that the donors really care about, where they can see that going. That's going to keep them giving on a regular basis, keep them excited as we begin to roll out the next big project.
We've got a great question that Toby asked here is, what's the percentage of goal reach for going public? In a little bit of how do we come to that number in a variety of ways, both what's the clawback or reach back for gifts, and maybe some of the counting. And I think this is mission critical for us, building confidence that development is an important thing in the life of the organization. So there's a few things. One is that the question that was asked in the chat was about counting disproportionately. We'll see the large academic institutions, and I'm talking the big, really big campaigns. They've been announcing in about the 40% range. Like I said, it's not really a secret of the campaign. The campaign's not a secret, and they'll announce earlier, but their run rate's really large. You'll find most organizations are announcing their campaign when they're at about 60 to 75% of goal. And I would say the added challenge then is what happens when that goal becomes clear that you're going to hit it. Even after you maybe have publicly announced what the campaign goal is, and then there's opportunities to think about how do you announce what the next goal might be if there is a next goal established. So those are some challenges that, again, you want to have ownership, that thinking about how do we engage volunteers. That's a great thing for that to be owned, not just by the development team, but by everybody, volunteers, leadership, etc. The question about back counting, I always encourage, it may sound overly simple, so I'm going to apologize on the front end, is when you are asking when you think about what you're going to count backwards. If you were asked at a board meeting, what is counted in this campaign, I would like you to be able to say that in 2 sentences. We are counting all gifts from this state to this state, in gifts that were made in the previous fiscal year that were to our priority of athletics, of cancer research, of the building project. So if it takes more than 2 sentences, your reach back is way too complicated. And then really always encourage transparency in your counting. So if these are deferred gifts that you're counting, have them below the line and be clear that they are deferred gifts. We want counting to build confidence in the organization and in the campaign, not raise questions. Hopefully, Toby, that answers your question. Andy, maybe you want to jump into this one. What are we seeing in regard to board of trustee giving related to the percentage of the campaign?
Yeah, I would say we look at trends. I mean, trustees continue to play, and board members, depending on your classification, continues to play a critical role in helping to achieve that, especially in the early phase. So depending on the size of organization and the goal, this can vary. I mean, I would say a lot of organizations, we're looking at around what I'm seeing from some of the projects I'm in, 20 to 25% from the board of really a key piece. It goes up depending on who you've got on that board and how big. But I would say you're in that high teens to 20% as you're really thinking about that campaign goal. Mark, what's your take? You probably have a different view on that than I did with some of your projects as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting, it depends on how the board's been assembled.
Yep.
Some boards were built as fundraising boards. I would say the last 5 years or so, the boards are a little less geared towards fundraising. That doesn't mean though that there's not other volunteer boards that are out there. If we look at healthcare, by the way, most have a governing board separate from a fundraising board. There's some overlap some places, sometimes not. Some places have multiple boards. I would go back to thinking about the gift chart and do you have people involved in leadership who can populate at least half of that, as a way to think about those top 10 to 15 gifts. And you want to make sure that they can populate it, because if the people who are helping set the priorities don't have the passion to support it, that's challenging. And every board should still have 100% participation. It is always stunning to me the number of places that don't. And it pains my development heart to see when places don't have that. But everybody making a gift really, really matters.
And making a gift within their level of means, if you will. So I mean, is it a top priority, a top two priority as they go into this? So as you think about getting the board to approve the final goal and where we're headed, spend some time with the board. Make sure they understand what it means to them, both in their time, and we're going to ask them to go out and have some conversations within their network, but also from a personal giving standpoint, if they haven't already made that gift. Is it a top priority for them and their family? They need to really think about that as gift officers or the president's having those discussions. That needs to be brought up front and center. We don't want to hide from that. To Mark's point about 100% participation, we want the board to know it's critical. They play a key role, whatever that means for them individually. We need them to play a critical role.
We have a question in here about when we say 7 to 8 years in average length, that's really a counting period. That's a counting period that most places are in active campaign. By the way, I've seen some as high as 11 or 12, and that just seems I wouldn't encourage it, because it basically lacks a sense of urgency. 7 and 8, to be honest with you, is challenging around a sense of urgency, but it's understandable what it looks like. But we usually would never recommend a written commitment of longer than 5 years. Once you hit beyond 5 years, pledge payments, the payoff rate in some research we've done over the years, the payoff rate for those pledges beyond 5 years starts to decline precipitously. You're also devaluing the gift when it gets longer than that. That said, I would be disingenuous if I didn't say, when someone comes to you and says, I will give you $1 million, it's $100,000 a year for 10 years, 99.9% of the institutions are going to say thank you, and they'll figure out how to acknowledge it appropriately. So pledges are usually 5 years as a maximum. And then written commitments, and I appreciate that you use the term, Jonah, written. Documented pledges matter for all the reasons in the world that we don't have to go into, but they do matter to have good pledges that are documented.
And Mark, these questions are reminding me something we probably skipped over in the planning phase. Really taking a hard look at those campaign policies, your overall gift acceptance policies as an organization. It's a great time to evaluate those, to make sure they're up to date, they're fitting with the times, and that gives you some protection. When you get donors coming to you saying, hey, I've got X, Y, Z, or I need 20 years or whatever, you've got something you can refer back to and say, no, here's our policy that we started before the campaign was even launched. It also covers reach back. So spending time in that early phase of making sure we've got things, we've thought through everything we possibly could have. There are always going to be some surprises, but getting that documented, updated, and getting buy-in on that from the board and your leadership, it's critical in that early phase, which I think it goes to some of these questions we're getting around that.
Well, and and the reason that momentum is so important here is it should feel different. I get that question a lot from people at conferences and on client sites, where they'll say, why should a campaign be different, or how is it different? It feels the same. And it feels the same if you don't take the steps and help them build on each other. So again, you think about that first phase as you're gaining a lot of information, of data, and that data is both statistical data out of your database, it's wealth screening, it's projections, it's information from donors, and you're building that action plan. What are we going to do with it? And and that's that leadership phase of then acting upon all that information. And as Andy talked about, as you go into that public phase, there's new priorities emerging, and we may have even checked off some priorities. And so each stage should come with an active plan that we're building on what we learned in the first piece, and we're adjusting our strategy for where we need to build more prospects, or where we need to strengthen our case, or maybe where we need staffing. But all those things are really about setting you up for success.
And just a few key takeaways. Mark touched on these, but I mean, really think about how do we engage your key donors, and always be looking ahead at those next opportunities. What's coming down the pipe? What can we be looking at that's gonna generate excitement for our donors, but also for the organization and our team. So as we wrap up, we've had a lot of questions. Mark, any other questions we want to touch on briefly before we?
Yeah, we have one more question here, and again, if there's a chance to slide in questions here, if you'd like to. Have we seen institutions adjust their endowment minimums, naming minimums during a campaign? The quick answer is yes. I would encourage you to do it before. And I would also, don't be afraid to, depending upon if building endowment has been a challenge, there might be opportunities. I do a few things. First of all, is check with your institution about what is a valuable endowment for them, right? I remember talking to a CFO once who said he didn't want to see any more endowment gifts, and I was stunned by it. I was like, what is wrong with this guy? And it was because the endowments were so small, it required them to do Herculean things to manage them, distribute them. My guess is we could get an enormous show of hands if we asked how many people got to apologize to a donor for not giving out their endowment gift. So we want to make sure the endowment's in a way that's meaningful, also marketable. I would encourage you, as Andy said, policies and procedures, adjust endowment gifts on the front end is the best way to do that. Question here, Andy, when is an appropriate time to ask a donor who declined earlier in the campaign due to timing?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a hard one too, because it depends on the individual donor, right? We're always going to be donor centric on where they're at. I would say just because they decline for whatever reason, continue to keep them informed. Let them know what's going on, what's happening. Let them know the excitement that's taking place. If they're interested in a certain priority project, what's going on? What impact is the campaign having on that? And normally they're going to give you that kind of signal that they might be ready. They might talk about, maybe something's changed in their life, that they're ready, but don't ever just close that door. Make sure they know you're thinking about them and giving them good updates on what's taking place, so they can feel and be part of the excitement along the way.
Yeah, and then there's a question really thinking about, successful engagement events. I would say this is that get them exposed to people who are the doers of the work. I have seen faculty or researchers talk about things that would bore me to tears personally, and they talk about it in such a way that's so amazingly exciting. So there are a lot of ways. Let them be passionate. Let them meet students. Let them talk to social workers who do the work. Those things really, really matter in the life of doing that. One more question here. We'll sneak in. We got like about a minute or two here. As we think about how to prioritize scholarship endowment over capital projects. And it is I would say go back to the concept we talked about a rubric, about thinking about what's important in the life of the institution. Donors have gotten really smart as they've been exposed to more and more campaigns. So if you can explain to them why scholarship endowment matters. I can think of two institutions that have prioritized endowed faculty positions. One of them had it tied to their strategic plan, and in the life of their campaign, they've raised 30 to 40 new endowed faculty positions. Another place didn't have it tied to their strategic plan, and they raised like 2 in 3 years. And actually, they should have been raising more. So really thinking about the business plan for your institution and how philanthropy makes that a reality will be an important way to talk about that. So my wife tells me that two things I could talk about forever: fundraising and history. You don't want to hear me talk about history, but we're almost at the end of our hour together. Feel free to reach out to Andy or I or any of our team here about to follow up on any of this. We really, really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend with us. And we wish you the best of luck, and please don't feel hesitate to reach out. Andy?
Yeah, thank you all. Enjoyed being with you. Let us know if there's any questions and I appreciate the time. Have a great rest of the day.